all. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to Engineering for Change, or E4C for short. Today we're very pleased to bring you the latest in E4C's 2013 webinar series. Today's webinar was developed in collaboration with Makeshift, and our guest presenter is Steve Daniels. My name is Yana Aranda, and I will be moderating today's webinar. When I'm not doing this, I work with the American Society of Mechanical Engineers in the Engineering for Global Development sector, where I am a Senior Program Manager. I'd like to take a moment now to tell you a bit about today's webinar, Makeshift Communication, or Designing for Scattered Signals. One of E4C's topical focus areas is information systems, and we're particularly concerned with capturing and sharing lessons learned in this area. So we're actually particularly glad to have the opportunity to address the issue of communications, especially in informal economies today. To do so, we've invited today's presenter, Steve Daniels, who is the founding editor of Makeshift, to talk about some of the work that his organization has been doing. Steve, thank you for joining us today. Before we get rolling, I'd also, no problem. Before we get rolling, I'd also like to take a moment to recognize the coordinators of the E4C webinar series generally. Between myself and my team with Holly Schneider-Brown, Alex Torres, and Victoria Chung, all at IEEE, we work hard to develop and deliver this webinar series. Thank you, team. If anybody out there has questions about the series, please be encouraged to contact myself or them via the email address visible on the bottom of the slide, webinars@engineeringforchange.org. Before we hand things over to our presenter for today, we thought it would be a good idea to remind you about Engineering for Change and who we are. E4C is a global community of now over 12,500 technically minded individuals, such as engineers, technologists, representatives from NGOs, social scientists who work together to solve critical humanitarian challenges, and many others, whether in water, energy, health, information systems, agriculture, sanitation, or other areas faced around the world today. We invite you to join E4C by becoming a member. E4C membership provides cost-free access to a growing inventory of field-tested solutions and related information from all the members of our coalition, including professional societies such as EWB USA, IEEE, ASCE, SWE, and ASHRAE, as well as academic supporters such as MIT's D-Lab, international development agencies such as USAID and Practical Action, and access to a passionate, engaged community working to make people's lives better all over the world. Registration is easy and it's free. Check out our website, engineeringforchange.org, to learn more and sign up. The webinar you're participating in today is one installment of the Engineering for Change webinar series. This free, publicly available series of online seminars showcases the best practices and thinking of leaders in the field who bring leading-edge technology and solutions to bear on global humanitarian development challenges. Information on upcoming installments in this series, as well as archived videos of past presentations, can be found on the E4C Webinars page, listed here, engineeringforchange-webinars.org, and we also provide an archive of all of our webinars on our YouTube channel, which you see listed here. E4C's next webinar will be on February 6, 2013 at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will be having this webinar with Dr. Conrad Mehta, who is the founding director of the Humanitarian Engineering and Social Entrepreneurship Program at Penn State University. The focus of the webinar will be on strengthening humanitarian ventures through concurrent research initiatives. For any of you out there who are in academia, this will be of particular interest. To register, please visit the E4C webinar page. The URL is again listed here. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. Let's see where everyone is from today. In the chat window, which is on the right-hand side, I invite you to please type in your location. As an example, I'll do it myself. Any technical questions or administrative problems should go in the chat window. Feel free to send a private chat to Holly or myself also as an option. You can also use the chat window to type any remarks you may have. During the webinar, please use the Q&A window located below the chat window to type in your questions to the presenter. If you are listening to the audio broadcast and you encounter any troubles, try hitting stop and then start. If that does not work, you can use the call-in number for the teleconference. You may also want to try opening WebEx in a different browser. Following the webinar, to request a certificate of completion showing 1 professional development hour PDH for this session, please provide your full name and date you completed this webinar, as well as the code that we will provide you at the end of the session by sending it to the email address listed here, eab-ceuadmin@ieee.org. See, we have folks from all over the world today. Very exciting. So let's talk a little bit about today's presenter. He's our first and only, so apologies for that typo. Steve is the founding editor of Makeshift, the magazine of innovation and informal economies around the world, and author of Making Do, which catalogs his research on Kenya's roadside engineering culture. Fascinated by technology and complex social systems, he works for IBM's Research Social Computing Group on projects for ICT4D, which stands for Information and Communication Technologies for Development, to smarter cities. His research on SMS for healthcare in Uganda was accepted to the ACM SIGDEV conference. Previously, he founded the annual Better World by Design conference, ran Brown University's chapter of Engineers Without Borders, and developed an entrepreneurship center and curriculum for at-risk teens. He is a very well-traveled and a very interesting man, and we are very pleased to have him. I will turn it over now to you, Steve, and look forward to hearing all about today's presentation.
All right, thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do at Makeshift and curating our most recent issue, which is on communication. And this is also an area I have a lot of background in my work at IBM, so I'm going to draw on that work as well, and maybe it'll all come together in the Q&A because I'm not even going to try to combine them. So this is my obligatory logo slide where I tell you a little bit about my history, which Jan already went into, but I started going down this track of humanitarian engineering in my experience with Engineers Without Borders, starting the Better World by Design conference, which happens every year at Brown University in RISD in Providence, doing research for my building. And now I split my time between IBM and Makeshift Magazine, and still trying to reconcile this history of designing technologies for emerging markets and researching technologies that come out of them. It's kind of a bit of a feedback loop in that one informs the other. So when I first joined IBM, I joined a research team that was focusing on Africa. So IBM had told this research team, you guys figure out what interesting technologies we should be looking at there. We ultimately proposed that IBM should have a dedicated research lab on the ground there, and that's opening up this month in Nairobi, which is very exciting for us. And it means that we're no longer working in that area unless I decide to go on assignment or something. But at the time, it was about two to 3 years ago, we were working on a project called Next Billion, and I helped the team think through sort of what would be a big platform play for IBM in this kind of basic mobile technology space with SMS and voice, since that is what the next billions of users we were focusing on would be connecting to the world through. So we developed this SMS app store, and because SMS and voice is a little bit of a, hard thing to visualize, so it's just our standard diagram. But the idea is it's a set of developer tools for SMS and voice app, all hosted in the cloud, and we could work with the telco on this. And maybe it'll find its way out to the world at some point, but it was a very interesting project, and did some research in working with Nigerian farmers on this. This is a project I worked on later. This is more of a web interface for a large-scale communication project, a UI I designed to help citizens monitor their engagement with the city as part of IBM's Smarter Cities initiative. And the idea is you could use this data to motivate behavior change through targeted challenges. Again, a project that was definitely more exploratory, hasn't necessarily made it to market, but I'm happy to discuss the research that went into all of this in the Q&A later on. Meanwhile, I launched Makeshift somewhere in this IBM journey, and designs coming out of resource-constrained environments. Because I knew that when I was working on ICT4D and all those kinds of command-served engineering projects, it became obvious that people coming in from outside of resource-constrained environments are not very good at adapting to that context and designing for that context. So I've been making sure that I keep myself embedded in that sort of research. We launched in October 2011 with the reculture issue, that's the one at the top left, and focused on reuse, repair, and recycling and informal economies. And we began to make connections among all these different kinds of environments that we consider informal. So whether it's a male working cluster in Kenya, which is what I did my thesis on, to work for the economy in Brooklyn, or at a large scale.
Steve, we seem to be having a little bit of difficulty. Steve, you seem to be cutting in and out a little bit.
Oh, is that right?
There we go. A little bit better. Thank you.
Okay. Let me know if it becomes a problem. I'll just make sure to dial in on a phone. So we ended up expanding what we mean by informal economies from the traditional definition of unregistered and undocumented businesses, primarily in emerging markets, to this broader definition of any sort of distributed, unregulated social system. So that could be anywhere. We did our mobility issue on how things move at the ground level. We did the resistance issue, which was a very interesting one for us, and fight back. Because it tested our journalistic style, I guess, in terms of how do we remain objective on such a politically charged issue in terms of what we're documenting. And we covered everything from the Arab Spring to disease-resistant clinics to electricians in Johannesburg, all along the lines of resistance. And I think all of these different flavors from the first three issues came together in issue 4, which is communication. And I think in some ways this gives the best idea of what Makeshift was meant to be, but has kind of matured in over time. And I sat down to write the letter from the editor for this issue at the end of making it, and I reflected on the previous 2 weeks that I had had.
Steve, would you mind repeating that one more time? In a great twist of irony, it seems that we're having a communication glitch.
Yeah, sure thing. And separately, and hopefully it will come together. I was saying that in the previous 2 weeks before I wrote the letter from the editor, I had some important experiences that solidified for me what the issue was about. And And so 2 weeks prior was actually Sandy. So that was a situation where I was sitting in a developed world context in New York City, and I was sitting on this building in my living room, ready for like a nice storm week. I'd be, hey, I'm dialed in again. Is this better?
Yes.
No. Okay. Hello?
Hello?
Okay, there we go. I'm on the phone now. Okay.
Much better.
So, good. So, I felt like I was protected by all this developed world infrastructure, and then we know what ended up happening. The power went out in the whole city. So first I lost my first line of communication, which was television. Turned to my phone, New York Times, CNN, but it had very little information. And it turned out that Twitter gave me the most reliable real-time updates from the city streets, and ultimately convinced me that the power wasn't coming back on. So 24 hours later, I ventured down 30 flights of stairs in search of Wi-Fi, and you started to see scenes like this. This is the signal hunt that everyone was on. And it really made the Internet seem like a more tangible entity, that it was more vulnerable to, say, the rust of physical infrastructure. And it brought people together in this interesting way. People who would otherwise maybe be working from their apartments, connected virtually to communities around the world, now we're forced to be sitting together in this geographic context. And then, whenever there are gaps in any sort of infrastructure, street economies emerge to fill them, and that's something we are always documenting at Makeshift. So, in the middle of all of this, I flew to Lagos before my power went back on, and of course, similar connectivity mobility challenges. The traffic there is legendary. But there is also another unanticipated communication challenge. So the official language in Nigeria is English. I was expecting to be able to communicate fine, but it turns out you can't really connect with people unless you speak Pidgin English. Pidgin is a combination of languages, the reaction to the introduction of a new language from outside, a bit of a compromise that allows cultures to interface with each other. So in this case, colonial English met resistance from a variety of tribal languages, emerged to form this informal but widely understood take on English that made it a little bit of a challenge for me to communicate. So in these 2 weeks, I became acutely aware that in spite of rapid globalization, which is what everyone talks about, communication is still largely a local phenomenon in a lot of cases. So following, the hashtag Sandy updates in New York, I became part of this grounded community in this isolated zone, and then navigating supposedly English-speaking Lagos, I was still an outsider. So in researching for this issue, this became a major theme for me, where we found many examples where communication was still rooted in the street level in this very local way. For example, we found cases of what are called data mules, so people who carry data physically. Networks of data mules are called internets because the networks where people physically walk data. Here's one in rural Cambodia where data is physically hauled on motorcycles. So there are these mobile hotspots that have an uplink and a downlink and some information cached, and those are delivered to health clinics and schools and that sort of thing in a rural context. This is a case in North Korea where the country is virtually shut off from the outside, and there are some groups of South Koreans who send messages across the border by balloon, and they'll send these packages full of letters and mixed media and DVDs and tapes and things like that, just hoping someone happens to find them and get these kinds of messages. There's a culture of traveling films in India where the projectors are loaded onto trucks and moved around to different villages. This is an interesting guy in Monrovia, Liberia. His name is Alfred Sirleaf, and people call him the analog blogger because he delivers news to the community on a chalkboard, and even has a business model with ad revenue. And you see he's now announcing that black slaves rule white masters as slave boy Barack Obama takes charge of the U.S. This is in New Delhi, where you can see in that little picture behind the bicycle, these are actually anti-urination messages sent by the government. these people are peeing on the walls, and the government said, well, if we put these deities around embedded in the walls, people will actually not do that. This is in Yangon, Burma, where residents use these curious doorbell mechanisms. So instead of telling someone, oh, I'm in apartment 1, apartment 2, ring my doorbell, it's like, oh, just pull the Lego or the paper clip, and he'll notify me that he's here and come up to my apartment. This is an invention by a farmer in South Africa who had some problems with people stealing his sheep. So he invented a technology for alerting him when his sheep were being stolen. So basically in this sheep collar, he has an accelerometer, a microprocessor, and an antenna. So whenever there's a stampede or some suspicious stomping activity, it calls his phone. Really simple technology that started in South Africa and is now being exported to other countries. And for most communities around the world, radio is still the primary mechanism for disseminating information. So this is a kid in Sierra Leone, Kelvin Doe, who was just brought to the Maker Faire in New York, a big DIY festival. And he pieced together a radio station from scrap parts, and he's helping other kids in the community make their own radio stations. So very powerful tool for local community information sharing. But the problem with local systems is that when they become centrally controlled, there's the danger of abuse of the system. So we saw a number of governments in the Arab Spring cut the cord on communication for entire countries at a time. But many of the examples that I've shown so far are sort of distributed, parallel, and more tolerant communication systems. And this begs the question of when you do some sort of ICT intervention in community, how can we build those qualities into the systems we're designing so that they're more distributed and parallel and not centrally controlled? And I think that's the best way to empower people and to create a system that is not susceptible to abuse. Of course, there's always trade-offs that need to be considered. And of course, even at the street level, we saw what you might expect as communication breaking down borders and barriers, some of those geographic and some of those cultural. We featured one study that looked at the use of Skype in long-distance relationships among Arab couples. So this is a case where communication technology is breaking down both geographic and cultural barriers. And there are all sorts of interesting dynamics where men would have access to the partner's accounts on Skype and Facebook to kind of monitor their activity, but women would also have these separate private accounts, and these sort of defying the norms there. And young couples with Skype so that they could be together without the presence of a chaperone, which they would always normally have to be. And women could sort of take off their protective garments and reveal their faces, and it's actually been quite disruptive, but not in a public way, and not in a way that a lot of people are documenting. This is not a new take on Mr. Potato Head, but a spin-off of an emerging field called teledildonics. So the idea being, can you connect people in relationships across long distance in a sensual or sexual sort of way? And this is a device called the Kissinger, created by a professor out of the National Taipei University. And the idea is you kind of smooch one of these devices and it replicates the lip motions on the other device, so you sort of feel like you're kissing. A little bit strange, but there's all sorts of conventions in Asia dedicated to this whole sector, and it's definitely an emerging phenomenon that people are interested in. This is a device called the FabPi. It's a DIY mesh network that you can print out the structure on any 3D printer, and the reflector on this thing uses some chicken wire. So this was made in Kabul in Afghanistan out of the Fab Lab. It's a fabrication facility there that has things like, I say 3D printer, I meant laser cutters. So it has laser cutters and 3D printers and all those kinds of computer-controlled fabrication devices. And they've replicated it in Kenya and in the U.S., and they've built and deployed more than 100 nodes of this mesh network, so it relays Wi-Fi signals and the radio signals across distance. So you can have it's something more like a distributed fault-tolerant communication system ideal that I was discussing earlier. This is a disaster relief use case. Many of you may be familiar with a platform called Ushahidi that does crowd mapping. So anyone can report some sort of instance on the ground, whether it's violence, whether it's a health clinic need, or it can be used for all sorts of applications, but the most common one is in disaster relief. And in this case in Haiti, the telco Telcel donated a short code that anyone could use to send in an instance of an emergency, and they received, they being the Ushahidi community, 45,000 messages. So these all needed to be translated, categorized, marked as actionable or not, and these all poured into what was called the Haiti Situation Room, which was is centered as Tufts, but it was really just a guy's living room. This guy Patrick Meyer, who was running Ushahidi, helping run Ushahidi at the time, and they had to rely on a massive online community of volunteers to do that kind of crowdsourced translation and categorization, and it had such a huge impact on the way that the relief was distributed on the ground by going through these messages, by mapping the infrastructure on the ground, because there was no reliable map of Port-au-Prince. And in many cases, these were people who had never set foot in Haiti. And it was a very interesting case of global community having a very ground-level impact. And lastly, on this kind of connecting across borders front, is the open data movement. So we had a feature on this, and featured some work by groups like Random Hacks of Kindness and Transparency International. They teamed up to have hackathons in a number of countries. So a bunch of programmers get together, they find big data sets, and they try to make it more accessible for people, because a lot of times data on shady institutions or governments are very much inaccessible if they're even available at all. So we're looking at the movement to make this information more accessible to the public. One example that came out of the Random Hacks of Kindness hackathons is an app called Ad Hoc. So it allows you to investigate and monitor the sources of political campaign funding. It's just something that would normally be very opaque to the general public. But of course, the last trend that we identified, so the first one was communication still remaining local. The second one was the cases where it broke down barriers. And the last one is that ubiquitous communication is now bringing new threats. And these threats need to be taken seriously, or at least thought about carefully in the design of systems and in the security that we embed into them. This is a threat, so to speak, that many of us may be familiar with, especially if you live in Europe or the U.S., the Nigerian scams. So these are called 419 scammers, and that refers to the Nigerian legal code for fraud. And they've been at it for decades now, sending scam emails trying to trick people into making wire transfers, promising large sums of money. And you might think that not a lot of people fall for this, but it's actually a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's been proven to work. So there was a Microsoft research study recently that investigated the question of not only why do Nigerian scammers stick to the same template of, hi, I'm a Nigerian prince, I have this large sum of money, things that anyone who receives these emails would be pretty immune to now and never take seriously. But actually, scammers from other countries will send emails saying that they're from Nigeria. And for most people, that's a red flag. But this Microsoft research study actually showed that it has a higher rate of success. And the reason is that the process from tricking someone into finally getting a wire transfer is quite lengthy and complicated. And by sending these very obvious emails up front, it basically filters out all but the most gullible or vulnerable recipients who are most likely to follow through with all those other steps. So it's a better use of the scammer's time, and it actually yields a higher rate of success. And the result is the FBI estimates that the Nigerian financial fraud cost the U.S. up to $2 billion a year. So it's actually still quite a successful phenomenon. This is getting a little bit more sophisticated and a little bit larger scale. This is a common scam called SIM-box fraud. And the idea is you get a big device called SIM-box, and you cram it with maybe hundreds of SIM cards, and you can reroute international calls through VoIP or the internet, and through your SIM-box locally, and it avoids the international fees from carriers, but these SIM-box fraudsters, so to speak, or scammers, will actually go and collect those international fees, and they raise pretty large sums of money. It's tiny amounts of money that build up as you scale up and over time. And there are entire security organizations that are dedicated to just looking and trying to detect and bust these SIM-box scammers in Nigeria and in Haiti and in some other countries. This is a device that has been put to good use, but in other cases that we don't have photos of, we know that it's been put to ill use. This is a device that was used in the Occupy movement called the Freedom Tower, and it's basically another off-the-grid kind of mesh internet network that provides an alternate route to either the internet or to a private network among these towers for occupiers. But we also know that similar radio towers have been built by Mexican drug cartels, off-the-grid DIY networks that have been deployed throughout Mexico and are quite sophisticated. And lastly, this is a case at a UT Austin where they haven't necessarily proven that this fraud has occurred, but they've demonstrated that this type of fraud is possible. And what this device is a GPS spoofer. So you can use this to actually create fraudulent financial transactions that would be time-stamped and geo-stamped, and you can create all sorts of financial disruptions in the market by sort of tricking the GPS receivers on sort of on the roofs of banks into shipping time delays and geo delays and these little bits of data. So they're trying to stay ahead in that sense. So we know that the amount of data transferred is exploding, and in Makeshift we always have a nice, pretty infographic to get this across. And in this infographic we tried to show both this kind of this tension that I described between the world connecting and globalizing and also localizing. So we talked about the cost of mobile data dropping and the number of mobile subscribers exploding, the amount of global bandwidth exploding you see in the map on the left, so that's not quite evenly distributed if you look at Europe versus Africa. But we also looked at cases where, let's say, things like language or localizing. I talked about the pidgin English in Nigeria. There's all sorts of ways that language is localized and split. And even though you'll see on the bottom left of this diagram, I guess I can have like a pointer thing here. You see here that it talks about sort of the death rate and also the growth rate of languages. So even though many languages are dying out, we're seeing that over here that as English spreads throughout the world as the dominant language, it's actually fracturing and splitting and localizing in ways that make sense for each culture, because it's just simply not something that can be forced everywhere, and not something that is universally applicable to all cultures. So it's being adapted at the street level every day. And the important reminder that we like to think about it as Makeshift is that behind these numbers is that drive to connect. So that's exactly what we're looking at by piecing together all of these street-level examples of what's really behind this data. So thanks, and I'd be happy to field questions about Makeshift, about these examples, about designing IT systems like I do at IBM, and what lessons we can draw from both of those experiences.
Thank you, Steve. We invite all of you to share your questions with Steve. You can use the Q&A window located right below the chat. All right. So while we're waiting, I think I would love to explore a little bit more, Steve, if you can talk about with some of these ICT for development models and examples that you've seen in terms of how the innovators or how the makers, builders of these solutions often come to develop their particular application, or what drives them. If it's a particular need, how do they bridge, a knowledge gap if there is one?
Sure. So one of the interesting mobile phone case studies, I guess, is occurring in Kenya, and that's a place where I've done a lot of research. And I met just, I guess, 2 weeks ago when I was in Nairobi with the Minister of Industrialization, and he was talking about how when a platform called M-Pesa was released, and M-Pesa is a mobile money transfer system where people can send money via effectively text message. It's actually a slightly different platform, but effectively texting money to people. And that is something that's just totally taken off in Kenya, where the estimates are that around 80% of the population has access to the system and has used the system. So he was talking about how when this system first came out, that he was expecting, and all the academics came in and said, you're going to have to do all of this ICT literacy education, you're going to go into the villages and teach people how to use these phones, and it ended up being that virtually zero outreach and zero education is necessary because because the phones were just so valuable to even the most elderly citizens and the most old-fashioned residents in these villages that they taught themselves. They figured out how to use it. They asked their friends, and it was just valuable enough and worth it for them to figure out how to use the system on their own. So there is something to be said for just finding that killer app and making it super useful for people. That said, you mentioned in my introduction that I'd written that paper on SMS for healthcare in Uganda, and that was specifically looking at the challenges they're specifically looking at the challenges of using SMS as the user interface in a developing world context. So what we found was in this system, which was a quiz related to HIV that was disseminated among several populations as an education platform to educate people about HIV, that it was actually very difficult for people to learn the SMS short codes and the SMS formatting, and there was a lot of noise in the data, and there did have to be some interventions to teach people the formatting in terms of the ones that were deployed within a company or within an organization were more successful because there was encouragement and education from the employers. We looked into some sorts of social incentives to incentivize people to use the system, and in those cases, people were better at it. So, yeah, all of that does need to be considered.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's very detailed. We do have a couple of questions that came in. The first question is, can you comment on regulated frequency bands between countries?
No. I'm not a communications expert. You know, I'm a designer and a programmer and a journalist, but I'm not a communications specialist. So, but if that person who asked the question can enlighten everyone on some of that, I don't know if we have that kind of interaction available. I'd be interested to hear what are the specific challenges that he's referring to.
Right. Perhaps over chat. Gary, you asked that question. Feel free to give us any more context over chat. All right. So one more question that's come in. Based on your experience, what are our current biggest global challenges as far as communication goes? What direction do you think we are heading, and where do you think we will be in 20 to 25 years? And this is a three-part question. What can we do as individuals to contribute to that future? A preloaded three-part question.
Yeah. So there are a few big global challenges, and I think one of them is the politics of communication that I alluded to earlier about the systems being centralized. And that's a problem we're hearing lots of debate about these days in terms of acts in the U.S. like SOPA cropping up where the government wants to take more control over how people use the Internet. We saw governments in the Arab Spring shut down the Internet. The UN is now saying that they want to take over regulations of the Internet, which has its pros and cons. And I think the way that the politics of these systems are designed are going to have a lot of implications for how they evolve over the coming decades. Another one I would say is how we reach out to the next billions of communications users or connected users. And there are a few challenges with that. One is how do you reach them? How do you get them on the grid? And we saw some innovative ideas around that with the data mules and the motorcycles. There's a case on the Amazon where people are trying to do a similar system with boats. But then there's also challenges around how do you design the user interfaces and systems in a culturally sensitive way. So that Skype paper that I talked about with the Arab relationships, use of Skype and Arab relationships, and that researcher talks about how Facebook, for example, is designed in a very sort of Western normative way, where it's, one person has access to each account, but it's actually more culturally appropriate to have multiple users be able to access an account in the way that men demand access to their partner's account, but maybe there's some sorts of permission settings that the woman would have control over, that sort of thing. So that's spreading a lot of Western values just through the way we design our software, and that's definitely a challenge.
Very interesting. And in terms of what we can do as individuals to contribute beyond being cognizant of some of these research findings, is there anything else that we can do?
So I think, the more people and more places and more cultures who have the knowledge to go out and design systems, the better. So, at Makeshift, we definitely we promote the idea that people in their own context know how to design best. So the more that we can build skills and do co-creation kinds of exercises, the better. And the more that we can document solutions that have worked elsewhere on a platform like E4C, where we can actually go into a particular context with many choices of solutions that have worked elsewhere and say, okay, well, what's the best solution for this context and how do we adapt it? I think that's a good approach, but I think the ways to engage are through teaching, through making, and through activism if you want to get engaged in the political side. So decide what's most interesting to you.
It's very insightful. Thanks for the shout out to E4C, but on that note, I'd also like to know, in terms of some of the communities of practice and maybe research hubs that you've worked with in researching for the communication issue, are there any in particular that you would recommend for our participants on our webinar today to be familiar with sources of information? Communities of practice in ICT for Dev or any research hubs that you think are particularly innovative or provide really insightful information.
Yeah, I think if you're interested in ICT for D, the best resource is Mobile Active. Mobile Active is a website that catalogs all the different platforms that are available, reviews them, talks about a lot of current events in that space. Our paper is documented on there, and if you're going to implement an ICT for D platform in a community, you'll want to make sure that you have the widest selection of platforms available in terms of finding the right implementation for you. So I think that's a very good resource, and most of the stories that we found for Makeshift took a lot of digging. Some of them came from pitches from our contributors on the ground. Some of them came from hunches of stories. The North Korea balloon story, that came from someone on the ground in Korea. But the Nigerian email scammer came kind of from the opposite way of, well, we know that we get these emails, we have that kind of interface with the Nigerian scammers, but what are the stories behind the scammers? And that took a lot of digging to find someone who's been hanging out at Nigerian cyber cafes. So for us, it really takes a lot of interpersonal connections and digging, and we try to make the results of that available. But yeah, I would say Makeshift is a good resource. Mobile Active is a good resource, E4C.
Cool. We have a couple more questions that have come in. Another question is, with the rise in distribution and affordability of smartphones around the world, how do you think social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter will change the way people communicate on their devices? In your opinion, how much is the developing world up to speed with these new offerings on the Facebook platform, for example, for international calls as of January 2013?
So that's a good question, and I found just anecdotally from my experience in Kenya and Nigeria that Africans are just, they use Facebook as if it's the whole internet. And that's actually something that's come out about Facebook strategy in emerging markets. There's a long feature written about how Facebook should be, or their challenge in the developing world is to basically convince people that Facebook is the equivalent to the internet, that it is the entry point to the internet. In the way maybe people in the developed world remember AOL being the internet in 1995, and they have to wait for the new CD to come in the mail, AOL 5.0, and that's your upgrade of the internet. So So that's their challenge. And it seems to be quite successful in certain markets. I get bombarded with Facebook messages from African contacts quite regularly. And even Google Plus, surprisingly.
Yeah. Great. Another question that kind of takes it totally different direction is if you have any interesting examples to share of technologies that block communication.
Technologies that block communication.
Mm-hmm. That's been used in around the world, especially in the developing world.
I don't think we came across any sort of DIY censorship or DIY firewall kinds of technologies, so I'm sure they exist. Maybe the GPS spoofer was a take on that. We did look into, there's an article about how netizens in China get around the firewall. So we did look at issues of censorship and how people circumvent it. In that article, there's a researcher, Tricia Wang, who's just an incredible technology ethnographer, and she paints these images of cyber cafes in China with hundreds of males huddled around computers, shirtless, just hunting for porn. So, sometimes circumventing censors is not the, data activist image that you would normally think of. People using the internet for, to fulfill their basic desires and pleasures, and that's kind of one of those reminders that, like I said on the last concluding slide, that behind these numbers is just this simple drive to connect that people have.
Absolutely. So, checking to see if we have any more questions here. While we wait for any additional questions, one last question, as you mentioned, that one of the best ways you can contribute to the future of communication, and especially, from the perspective of the developing world, is through teaching, making, and activism. What other, perhaps, examples do you have of local training centers throughout the developing world that are kind of taking the bull by the horns and enabling communities to overcome any kind of barriers, whether that means informally, as in the asking of neighbors and having kind of a pseudo support group, to others that you think are particularly memorable from your experience?
Yeah, there's a lot of effort going into supporting developer communities in the developing world right now, and some of these cases are more successful than others. I think a kind of flagship or star child, poster child of this movement right now is iHub in Nairobi. So a space for developers, or a community for developers in Nairobi. One of the biggest challenges is bridging that sort of educated, usually middle class or well-off developer community with, say, most of the people who are using the phones or could benefit from additional applications to be developed. So when you're talking about from an E4C kind of humanitarian angle, the reach of these hubs can be limited because on a surface level they only reach the educated communities. But the hope is that there will be bridges created, and that will sort of trickle down, and hopefully some co-creation exercises will come out of them. But the iHub model is very interesting, and it's been replicated. It's only a few years old now, like maybe 3 years, and it's already been replicated maybe 12 times around Africa.
Is there a major event where some of these developer communities gather outside of the iHub?
I'm not sure if there's a continent-wide meeting, but they're now, there's some pitch competitions, the way, they're replicating the Silicon Valley model with the Y Combinator and the TechCrunch Pitch Conference. So they have, there's an East Africa Pitch Conference called Pivot. So there is a lot of momentum going, and there are some connections being formed.
Fantastic. All right, so it looks like I see no further questions from our participants. So I'll just take this moment to share with everybody some information in terms of those of you who are looking to secure some PDH credits. We want to first and foremost thank you all for attending and your questions, and certainly we will get a recording of this. We recognize that we had a little bit of trouble with the sound at the beginning of the webinar, so we will do our best to either provide some labels for the recording or see if we can fix the beginning portion. So with that in mind, please do keep an eye out on our YouTube channel as well as on the webinar's page for the recording. We should have it up soon. The URL for the webinar's page is listed right there. The PDH code for this webinar is a 12913SD, and the email address where you can submit that along with your name is listed. If you have any more questions, please feel free to email us at webinars@engineeringforchange.org, or you can reach out to Steve directly. His email and Twitter handle are listed here, or rather just his Twitter handle, so I hope you're all on Twitter. And I'd like to thank you all again, and thank you, Steve, for this incredible insight into communication worldwide. Have a great day, evening, morning, everybody, and we'll catch you on the next webinar on February the 6th. Take care.